I'll put this online, and we will start out. The baracha for Torah study is Baruch Atah Eloheinu melech haolam asher ksanu tzitav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, and we get to continue on with Sefer Daniel. This is oh wait, I just forgot this part. The chapter 5 of the book of Daniel picks up on some themes of chapter 4, but has one of the more famous biblical scenes in it, which is the writing on the wall. You'll see it does, I think, feel very different from other parts of the Tanakh, which is to say, it's there are lots of miracles and odd things that happened over the course of the Tanakh, but you get used to the type of miracles and the type of things that happen. This is different. This isn't that. So we'll talk about that as we go through. In any event, if you remember last time, in chapter 4, Daniel successfully interprets a dream. It's like chapter 2, where like the king asks Daniel to interpret a dream. None of the other, diviners and dream interpreters and soothsayers and Chaldeans can interpret it. Calls upon Daniel, who proves to be the most wise, and after that, the king realizes that that Daniel is the wisest of all, and Daniel's God is the greatest of all. However, in that instance, the part of the prediction was that the king would go mad and lose his throne. So that's what happens at the end of chapter 4. The king sort of goes mad and flees to the wilderness, and his son becomes king in his place, and that's where we pick up chapter 5, King Balthazar. Now, as the JPS and as Alter will note, in the event, like the chronology is confused and like not quite right, meaning it's not quite historic. This is what I mentioned again last time, that this book may have originally been understood as a allegory. It's written, or there are any number of clues that it's written much later than the events it's describing, sort of projecting back. So again, most scholars assume that this is written around the time of the Hasmoneans, the 160s BCE, but it says it's being written in the early days of the Babylonian exile, 400 years previous to that. So sort of it's being written, like as a period piece that you can watch something on TV that is, or a movie that is like projecting back and telling a story from the past. And that's what this is doing. And part of the indication that this is what this is doing is that the timeline's all confused, right? So even the first words of chapter 5, King Balthazar. Balthazar was in fact a ruler after the previous king went mad and ran away, but only ruled as a regent, meaning never in fact took the throne as king, but sort of like ruled as a substitute after his father had run off going crazy. And the names are like mixed up. Balthazar's father was a different, it was Navonius, who was the one who ran off mad, not Nebuchadnezzar, as the book says. So there's a number of things where it's sort of like almost right, but not quite right. Again, maybe similar to the way that you can watch a movie or a period TV show, and they've got some things right, but some things confused. That's what's going on here. It's not like the larger point. It's just, but that's just sort of like to keep in mind that that this is not a historic telling. It's sort of a legendary telling. Pause. This makes sense? So that. So we'll have King Balthazar, but again, he's a regent, not really the king, but for the purposes of the story, he's the king. And again, as we mentioned last time, there actually was a king who ran off mad, and his son had to take his place. That's this. Chapter 5. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and before the 1,000 he drank wine with the wine on his tongue. Belshazzar said to bring the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken away from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Now, again, Nebuchadnezzar, not literally his father, his ancestor, but also like not literally his ancestor, because this royal line was different from Nebuchadnezzar's royal line. There was a coup in between, but they occupy the same throne. So it's not like literally his father, either in the paternal sense or in the ancestor sense. But he sits on a throne, but that's not the kind of thing that the author here is concerned with. So they're having a big wine party. We've seen this before elsewhere, right? And as Alter notes, the big wine party feels a little bit more Persian than Babylonian. Apparently they were known for big wine feasts more than the Babylonians were. And Nebuchadnezzar, of course, we know from the Book of Kings, destroyed the temple and sacked it, taking the gold vessels back to Babylon with him. So big party. He shouts, bring out the good stuff, bring out the cool gold and silver vessels so that we can all drink from them. It's a big party. All the nobles, all of the entourage, the hangers-on, the wives, the concubines, everyone's drinking. And now he says, bring out the vessels from that temple in Jerusalem that they had to their God, and we'll drink from those. You may have read enough of the Tanakh to know the guy saying, let's all have a party and drinking from the temple vessels is not going to turn out good for him. He's not going to have a happy ending. So using them for a whole purpose, for a secular purpose, bad enough. But like sort of like the concubines, like it really like too much. It's not going to end well for the guy partying with the sacred vessels of that Moses and the gang created for Aaron. Not going to end well. Verse 3, but of course they have that. Then, by the way, this the fact that it takes place here is part of presumably why it midrashically, this scene bleeds into Achashverosh's scene. Of course, the beginning of the Purim story begins with Achashverosh having a big party. You know, he's a guy who likes wine, women, and song. And it just says there that they're drinking. But Rashi and the Midrash is that Achashverosh and the gang are drinking out of temple vessels that they took from these guys. But there's no indication of that in the text. Possibly what happened is that Daniel, fairly obscure book that people don't read so much, and Esther, prominent book that people are very familiar with and read all the time, that they just sort of like blended that this scene sort of like blended into that scene the way sometimes we get things confused or similar stories confused. Either way, they're definitely drinking out of the temple vessels. Verse 3, then did they bring the vessels of gold that had been taken away from the temple of the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. For great, very cinematic, by the way, right? Like if you've been following the story up till now, like seeing these things make a reappearance, these sacred vessels from the book of Exodus make their appearance here. Powerful. Verse 4, they drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Whew. All the more so these guys, not only are they drinking out of the temple vessels and like a wine feast, but while drinking out of the vessels of gold, they're praising gods of gold. So this is dark. This is not good. Page 5, verse 5. At that very moment, the fingers of a man's hand came out and wrote before the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the palm of the hand that was writing. Then did the king's countenance change, and his thoughts panicked him, and the cords of his loins went slack, and his knees knocked together. The king called out loudly to bring in his magicians, Chaldeans, and different. The king spoke out and said to the sages of Babylonia, whichever man reads this writing and tells me its meaning shall wear royal purple and have golden collar around his neck and rule over a third of the kingdom. We'll pause there. All right. So, Ezehu, what's going on here? This, as I say, is a different sort of miracle. You've read this far. We haven't seen anything like this ever. Miracles have been, Moses hitting the river and something happening, or Moses, holding up his staff and something happening, or the skies clouding over and something happening, or there are all sorts of miracles that we've seen. But this sort of this sort of thing from the special effects department of what really seems to be a disembodied hand writing on the wall in full view of everyone. This is totally unique. So again, different genre of biblical book. Here we're seeing something the likes of which we haven't seen before. There's no implication here that they're seeing it because they're drunk, right? Because on some level, they're drinking. They're not taking drugs, right? Like this isn't like a hallucination. They're not, taking mushrooms or something that's or some sort of hallucinogen that's causing them to perceive something that's not there. Definitely, the book thinks that this is there. It's actually there. And it seems to go out of its way to indicate that this is happening and it's real. The fingers of a man's hand came out and wrote on the wall. And the king sees this and freaks out. And so there's a few just alters comments here. Though the finger of God appears in the Exodus story, right? Like the both the tablets are written with the finger of God when the Egyptian magicians say that it's realized that they can't recreate what Moses is doing. They say it's the finger of God. Like it's sort of like God's hand, God's finger, God's arm are frequent throughout the Exodus story. Though the finger of God appears in the Exodus story, it's essentially metaphorical, right? When they say this is the hand of God or the finger of God, they mean this is God's doing. They don't mean that God has a literal hand. This sort of spooky, quasi-magical apparition is not characteristic of earlier biblical narrative. Then he notes that when it says that this was before the lampstand, the likely reason for this detail, because normally we're not given like the feng shui of the room. We're normally not given like where the chairs were and things like that. Like, why does it say before the lampstand? The altar's comment is like the likely reason for this detail is that the writing on the wall is thus fully illuminated, so the visual legibility of the letters is not the issue. So there's no sort of sense of like that this is sort of like taking place in half darkness or something like this. This is like clearly in view, and everyone's clearly seeing it, as it were. And so he sees the hand writing, and the king freaks out, right? His thoughts panic him. And the cords of his loins went slack and his knees knocked together. The loins, alters comment again, the loins are imagined in biblical usage as a seat of strength. Gird your loins means get ready to fight, right? Sort of strengthen yourself up. The physical realization of the king's dismay is unusual and virtually satiric, right? Like sort of like he's going weak, and he feels that in his kishkas, and his knees sort of literally knocking together like that. That's still our metaphor for like being scared, right? In a cartoonish way. I'll pause here. Thoughts, reflections on it? So this is literally the writing on the wall, and because you know what the phrase "writing on the wall" means, you know what it's going to mean for the king. The writing's on the wall, and it's a disembodied hand. That's totally wild, and it's clearly visible because he wants others to read it. He
Rabbi,
says, yeah, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt. The Koran translation says the king saw the palm of the hand that was writing.
Yes.
So it was a human hand.
Yeah, that's it. It's there's not a sense that it's just a pen or whatever, pencil in the air, nor is it a sense that it's a supernatural looking hand. I mean, it doesn't not look like a hand. Like, I don't know, I feel like if you were to make the movie of this, the temptation might be to make it like a skeletal hand or a Grim Reaper hand or a monstrous hand or a zombie hand or like something that like looks not natural. But to Alan's point, it's like he sees the palm of the hand, like meaning that he sort of like sees like that it's a hand. Yeah. So JPS translates, just then the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand, so the king could see the hand as it wrote. The Aramaic here, it's on verse 5. The Aramaic is going the wrong direction. Basha'ata, that time, nafka etzba'an di yad enesh, which is really like the fingers of a man's hand or a human hand. The katvam lekabel nivra al gera di katal hechla on the walls of the palace. So it's like the Aramaic really is like it's like the fingers. He sees the fingers of a human hand. So yeah, it's mamish a hand. And the Jewish Study Bible comment is like says the fingers of a human hand, compare the finger of God that brings the plagues in Exodus 8:19, or writes the 10 Commandments in Exodus 31:18. So yeah, that and the lampstand means that everyone can see it. The fact that he asks that the king spoke out loud and said, whichever man reads this writing and tells me its meaning shall wear royal purple and have a golden collar around his neck and rule over a third of the kingdom, like that, which is similar to these earlier promises that in the earlier chapters. The fact that he says like who can read it indicates that it might not be in a familiar script. Because if it were in the usual script, all you'd have to do is interpret it, tell me what it means. But he says whoever can read this and interpret it, which means that it doesn't seem to be in letters that he can understand. Babylonian letters are what we think of as Hebrew letters, meaning again the earlier biblical generations would have written in what we call Paleo Hebrew, letters that you sometimes see in museums, in the Israel Museum, and things like that. The block letters that we think of as Hebrew letters that look like this are the Babylonian Aramaic letters that they come back from the exile with. So so the king, like us, would have understood these sorts of regular sorts of Hebrew characters. So this presumably aren't those characters. So that's his problem. They're being written, the writing's on the wall and he can't read it. Others? Verse 8. So great reward to whoever can read it. This is going to be exactly like what we've seen before. You're not going to be surprised by what happens next. Then did the king's sages come in, but they could not read the writing, nor make its meaning known to the king. Shocking. I thought third time's a charm. I thought they would totally be like, oh, we got this. So of course they can't read it. 9. Then did King Belshazzar greatly panicked, and his countenance changed, and his nobles were confounded, because, as in the earlier instances, everyone forgets that Daniel exists. Like in the 4th chapter, where it's like why do you constantly call these clowns when you know you've got someone on staff? But each time they don't know. And each time, of course, it's a different king, or it seems to be a different king who forgot, or doesn't know, or everyone's too scared to say, the usual guys can't do it, but there's one sort of person of the despised group that can. There's 10, or it's all sort of different versions of the same story. Because of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen came into the banquet hall. Now, of course, the queen was already there, meaning that he was drinking with his wives and concubines. That's what was going on. So what is this? Alter assumes that it's the queen mother. And he assumes it's the queen mother, one, because she wasn't there to begin with. Two, because we'll see in a moment, she's going to be the one who remembers Daniel. So the fact that the younger king and his presumably younger wives and concubines and advisors don't remember Daniel, but this woman walks in and does, is why he assumes it's the queen mother and not the queen herself. And that's just sort of because it makes more sense. She would remember, oh, there's this guy who predicted my husband, your dad, would run off crazy, and that's exactly what happened. So even if the son doesn't know it, the mother does remember, right?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Rabbi? This also is reminiscent of Joseph, because in the story of Joseph, there was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph.
Right. That's the end of the story, right? The Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, and and comes to a bad end, or his house comes to a bad end because of that. Here, he's also going to come to a bad end, and he doesn't know, right? And of course, if he had done the homework, as the saying goes, and had Daniel hang around the court, Daniel would have said something like, excuse me, king, I'm, but dust and ashes, but don't have a party using the temple vessels, right? Like this. So yeah, exactly. Not knowing has its consequences. That is totally a biblical theme. So a queen walks in. The queen walks into the banquet hall. This is the back end of verse 10. The queen spoke out, and again, he assumes, Alter assumes queen mother, really. Spoke out and said, "May the king live forever. Let not your thoughts panic you, nor your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods resides. And in your father's days, enlightenment and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, raised him up as master of the soothsayers, the magicians, the Chaldeans, the diviners, because exceeding spirit and knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams and explain enigmas and untie knotty matters were found in Daniel, to whom the king gave the name Balthazar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will tell its meaning." Right? That's much more of a queen mother sort of statement than a queen statement. That's much more, I'm your mother, this happened to me and your dad, than it would be something that a wife would say, right? Sort of, obviously. So this, and Alter notes the phrase "untie knotty matters." The same idiom, Misharai Kitrin, that was used for the slackening of the cords of the king's loins, is now used antithetically to express not weakness but strength in unraveling matters. So that's part of the biblical part of, in what is something of a less artful narrative, recalling of traditional biblical artful writing, of using the same phrase again. There for the king's weakening, here for Daniel's strength. Untie knotty matters. Nice turn of phrase. So she all but gives the order. If you want something done, you gotta call Daniel. Verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. The king spoke out and said, "You are Daniel, who is of the exiles from Judah, whom my father brought from Judah. Again, like why he needs to say this, we don't know. But like this is again the style of this book where it's even more wordy than usual. Certainly more wordy than the Torah is, and wordy in a different way than the book of Esther. And I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods resides within you, and that enlightenment and understanding and exceeding wisdom are found within you, as with the two previous instances of Daniel coming before a king. They always begin with this polytheism, not having learned from the whole situation. And now, verse 15, and now the sages and the magicians were brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make its meaning known to me, but they could not tell the thing's meaning. Again, why we need the summary, not entirely clear, but the style of the book is to repeat things verbatim. Verse 16, and I have heard of you that you can interpret meanings and untie knotty matters. Now, if you can read the writing and make its meaning known to me, you shall wear royal purple, and a golden collar shall be round your neck, and over a third of the kingdom you shall rule. Right? This grand promise. So that's the big lead-in, and we can guess what's going to come next. But this is it. So you'd have a new paragraph here, verse 17. Then did Daniel speak out and say before the king, let your gift be yours, and your presents give to another. I read the writing and the meaning. I read the writing, and the meaning I shall make known to the king. So this is Daniel's magnanimity. Keep it. Why does he not want the money? If you take the money, it calls into question your motivations. If you take the money, as the Torah says, bribes can blind the eyes even of the just. So this actually recounts slightly, to me at least, Ahasuerus when Haman, who off says, I'll give you, a truckload of silver and gold if you let me kill the Jew. Like similarly here, Daniel refuses payment. He knows Daniel's already read it, so he knows what it means, and obviously we know that that drinking out of the temple vessel's king isn't going to be getting a good. It's not going to be good. So also for this reason, maybe he doesn't want payment. He's not going to take payment to deliver a nasty message.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
My translation says, Daniel says, but I will read the writing. So at this point,
but I will read the writing, but I won't take the money. Sorry, did I say it wrong? He says, let the gift be yours and your presents give to another. I shall read the writing and the meaning I shall make known to the king. So I'm not taking the money, but I will read the writing, or the JPS. You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your presents to others, but I will read the writing of the king and make its meaning known to him. Right. So the irony there is that the king's not going to be around long enough to give anything to anyone. But he's going to be gone before the check would even have cleared. Verse 17, then did Daniel speak out and say before the king, gifts be yours and your presence be known to another. I shall read the writing, the meaning I shall make known to the king. You, O king, the Most High God gave kingship and greatness and honor and glory to Nebuchadnezzar your father. And again, the author seems not to be aware that Nebuchadnezzar is not his father or his direct ancestor. 19, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all people, nations, and tongues were trembling and fearful before him, whom he would slay, and whom he would let live, and whom he would raise up, and whom he would bring low. Right? Whatever he wanted to do, he could do. Why could he do it? Because God let him do it. God gave him all this glory to have all this power. 20. And when his heart was overweening and his spirit grew mighty in defiance, he was taken down from his royal throne and his glory was removed from him. And he was driven from humankind, and his heart was leveled with the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. Grass, like the oxen, they fed him, and from the dew of the heavens his body was moistened, until he knew that the Most High God rules over the kingdom of man, and whom he will raise, and whom he will, he raises over it. We'll pause there. So again, that's the previous chapter, right? Like sort of that his father went mad and went off to the wilderness and sort of was barking like a donkey, as it was braying like a donkey, as it were, right? He's like, like he went mad and like lost his sense of humanity, and he was out like eating animal food and acting like an animal. His heart was leveled with the animals. So instead, he was risen up to as high as a person could go. But then, because his heart was haughty, because he thought that this is me and this isn't God who's doing all this stuff, God brings him lower than all other men and onto the level with the animals, and he's sort of like living out there like a wild man with the beasts. So Daniel gives that all his background, and that of course was something of the previous chapter, and it seems also like a historical note that there's a king who went mad and went off and lived with the beasts, and his son was made regent in his stead. Of course, the Tanakh being the Tanakh, it doesn't say, hey, you know what, he had a mental break, he really could have used some therapy. It says that this is God brought him high and God brought him low. Verse 22. So after that whole thing of like, do you remember what happened? And you, his son, Belshazzar, similar to but not identical with the Daniel's Babylonian name, your heart has not been humbled, though you have known all of this. And against the Lord of the heavens, you have exalted yourself, and you have brought the vessels of his house before you, and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine in them, and you praised gods of silver and gold, bronze, wood, and stone, who do not see, and who do not hear, and do not know. And the God in whose hand is your life breath, and all your ways are his, you do not glorify. So again, Daniel here is like, what are you doing? Like, before I read this stuff, are you even paying attention? Your father was the mightiest man ever, and then because he ignored God, was brought lower than any man ever. You had the opportunity, knowing all of this, to not repeat his mistakes, but you're essentially repeating his mistakes. Like, so what do you think is going to happen? The same thing that happened to him is going to happen to you. So this thing, like, but he's walking him through it step by step. You knew all of this, and you failed the test. So this is verse 24. Then before him was sent, or before him, maybe before God, something like this. Like he capitalizes the him. Or Alter does, right? Then before him was sent the palm of a hand, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. So now he's going to read it. And the fact that he reads it out loud and doesn't just interpret, again, indicates that the writing on the wall was visible to everyone. That's the point, but not legible to everyone, meaning they couldn't decipher the characters. It's not like they could decipher the characters but didn't know the meaning. They couldn't decipher the characters. Mene, mene, tekel ufsharim. That's the writing on the wall. This is the meaning of the word. Mene. God has numbered your kingship and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have weighed on the scales and been found wanting. Peras. Your kingdom has been broken apart and given to Media and Persia. We'll unpack all of this in a moment, but we may as well make it to the end. Then Balthazar spoke, and they clothed Daniel in royal purple and put a golden collar around his neck and proclaimed of him that he should rule over a third of the kingdom. read the first verse of chapter 6 because it is the end of the story. On that very night, Balthazar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom when he was 62 years old. All right, we'll pause there.
It seems a little strange that he has just given the king probably the worst news that he could possibly get, and he still rewards him.
Exactly. So it maps on with what happened before. The two previous times, like he gave bad readings and like wasn't punished, and in fact was rewarded. This is the most extreme of them all. Robert Alter makes the same note you do, Alan. As it may seem odd that he should be rewarded rather than beheaded for bringing up so dire a message to the king. Of course, our story needs a happy ending from the Jewish point of view, but perhaps you are to infer that Belshazzar is exercising an honorable sense of fairness. He promised all this grandeur to the person who succeeded in telling him the meaning of the writing on the wall, and this Daniel has managed to do, however ominous the writing. So, yes, obviously, in real life, we would assume that telling the king that you were an idiot, you didn't learn the basic lessons that were right in front of you all along, and so you're going to be killed, and everything your family has built up is going to be given to your enemies. Presumably, that gets you beheaded, right? Like this is not a recipe for job security, but in the story, maybe just to keep the legend going, or because it's the book of Daniel, not the book of Belshazzar, Daniel is rewarded. The king follows through on his promise. Read it and I'll reward you, not give me a good reading and I'll reward you. So, yeah. I'd
like to make a comment. Let's, for a moment, look upon this as an entertainment, the whole story. And the analogy I can think of is the Rocky Horror Show, which was a form of entertainment, if you're old enough to remember, whose audience knew exactly what was going to happen, knew the dialogue word for word. And so look at this as an entertainment now, and the audience for this knows the word because of the repetition of the same structure and the same words. They can say the words along with the narrator, and they know what's going to happen, and they can say, watch this, watch what happens next. This is almost like an entertainment for people.
Well, right. So, I mean, there could be an element of that, right? That's sort of like not uncommon. Like you're right with Rocky Horror, though. Like that's sort of like that's a clear example. People go back for the same thing. Most musicals work that way, right? Like people go to musicals because they're familiar with them, or go to them again and again because they're familiar with them, because they enjoy the repetition. And of course, Hollywood movies are famously formulaic. We know the ending. We just want to. There's something in the cathartic nature of the telling that makes it that brings out an emotional response. Though we know the ending, we still have it's a certain framing that makes it powerful. So here, I mean, the special effects sort of do make it exciting, right? Like the disembodied hand on the wall, like clearly is something to grab a large audience's attention. Right, and then like the unique power of Daniel sort of like teaches its own lesson. Yeah. There's lots. So this writing on the wall, what's going on here? Many tekel of shine. Again, going through the Alter's comments on it. Mine, this is a recognizable Aramaic verb that means to count or to number. Right, so it says God has numbered your kingship and brought you to the end. Like that's sort of literally your days are numbered. And like the writing on the wall is a take on the word for numbered, right? Like the it's repeated. Well, he says like the first one may be repeated because you need four words, because there are four kingdoms in the previous dream. In chapter 4's dream, there are four great kingdoms of the world. So 4 is one of the themes going through it. So though there are 3 different words, there are 4 words on the wall. The Aramaic verb that means to counter, to number, it has been widely recognized since the 19th century that the 3 words point to a prophecy that is not mainly focused on Belshazzar's personal fate. The 3 words are the names of 3 ancient coins. The mina, a valuable coin worth 60 shekels. The shekel, tekal, is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew term, because the shin in Hebrew becomes a t in Aramaic. And the paras, who's a half shekel. The verbal root, as is evident in Daniel's interpretation, means to break apart. In Rabbinic Hebrew, this verbal stem is also used for breaking bread, right? So on those levels, like some of these words, like the tekel is, again, shekel, like Aramaic and Hebrew are related languages. So the shin in Hebrew becomes a t in Aramaic. So the shekel becomes a tekel, shekel being a weight, right? It's the name of a coin, as you know, but also like it's the name of a weight, like the pound, right? Presumably, I'm not an expert in monetary history, but presumably the British pound began as a pound of something, or like the value of a pound of something, right? It's not, I can't imagine it's a coincidence. So same thing is true with shekel. Shekel is a weight. And then a shekel of silver becomes a shekel, right? So like the pound. So like the so all of these things are weights of coins. Pras, lo tifros mina tzibor, don't separate from the community. A pras is a separation or a breaking apart. So each word has multiple meanings to it, but he explains it along the way. Mine, numbered, your days are numbered. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales, right? Like this constant theme that we've encountered of God judges you, God weighs your picture as the scales of justice, right? Like, or the kind of scales that they would have had. They wouldn't have a bathroom scale like we have. Like, obviously they have a scale with weights on it. God has weighed you, and you with weights, you'd put weights on one side of the scale, and you've been left wanting. Like your deeds don't balance. You've failed. And plus your kingdom has been broken apart and given to Media and Persia. Like we're going to give this to you. We're going to give everything to your enemies because you've been left wanting. The JPS comment on it is the words are interpreted on 2 levels. Their weights, mina in Aramaic is a mina, a little more than half a kilogram, about 20 ounces. Tekel is a shekel, 11 grams or less, about half an ounce. Nupsharin, a dual form of paras, is at 2 half minas. Paras, of course, is also Persia in Hebrew, meaning the last one. The last one is also a pun on the word Persia, which is one of the kingdoms that's going to come and take away this kingdom. So Daniel reads the writing on the wall. That night, everything he says comes to pass, and a new king from a different kingdom takes the throne. So what does it mean to be able to read the writing on the wall? The writing on the wall is that it's all over. It's all coming to an end, and it's your fault. And the ability to read it is not something that everybody has. So this is why in English we say the writings on the wall means that it's all over for you. And he can't read the writing on the wall is the guy who is sort of like too wrapped up in his own misdeeds to be able to interpret what's there. or I can read the writing on the wall is I know enough to know that it's over.
Rabbi,
Yep.
to Rich's point about entertainment value, excuse me, we keep saying, first of all, Daniel got to do what nobody else could do. They called him as a last resort. Then this whole grandiose verbiage in there where he's telling Daniel, you this and you that, which of course Daniel knows. But then at the very end, if God wanted to send a message, he could have written it plainly on the wall. But no, they had it. He had to disguise it somehow to call Daniel. So this whole thing seems like it was written in just as a dramatic story.
Right. In order to allow Daniel to deliver the.
Yeah, to elevate Daniel, to venerate him, so to speak.
Right, exactly. And give right. And if you do read this as like sort of like a way to, I mean, again, like it's this one thing that may be the case throughout, just in different stylistic ways, is that some say that Bible is written in a hortatory manner. This was again, I read a book earlier this year by Rabbi Josh Berman, who's an Orthodox scholar at Bar-Ilan. So it's all hortatory meaning essentially something like a halftime speech, something inspirational. So he was reading it like to try and like, how can, as an Orthodox Jew, how can I understand all these supernatural miracles that like don't seem like they actually happen? Like how can I still believe the Torah being perfect and from God, even if like I don't believe that 3 million Jews walked out of Egypt? And he says it's a different style of writing. It's hortatory. It's meant to be inspirational and to fill your heart the way, again, like a halftime speech is supposed to. It's not about like accuracy. We've got these guys. Nobody believes in us. We can do it. You guys can go out there and you own them. You've got this. Like that may or may not be true that you own them. You got this and no one believes in us. But by saying it, you can change the course of the future. Is the essential belief. He's saying that the whole Tanakh is sort of like written maybe like in this style, and that we make a mistake by trying to read it like it's literal history when it's more of a halftime speech. So this is sort of like God says things that only our people can get. We're the ones who can read the writing on the wall. We're the ones who aren't so dumb as to read as to have parties with the temple vessels, more or less. Like we can do this. This is us. We can do it. And even though they've got more power, we're the ones that have this power. And that in some sense, so like to that like whole entertainment thing, like that it's that, and that we're supposed to be like, and that even the Exodus story, we're supposed to be like, yeah, you know what? We can stand up to the pharaohs of this world. We can do it. That's all a halftime speech. And that's why we read it every week. That's why we read the prayers every day and all this, like sort of like, yeah, and because it's Yom HaAtzmaut, right? That's what Independence Days are. Like we're supposed, like whether it's a 4th of July or whatever, like you're supposed to be like, you know what? Yeah, we are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal and all are endowed by their Creator with a certain inalienable human, like that. Like it's all that. So yes, it could like it's all sort of like crafted to create that. God could have written, "Your days are numbered," but doesn't, in order to set up the scene where we can be like, yeah.
In good Hollywood fashion, he even bent the relationships of the king and the queen. And
Right, exactly. There's in good Hollywood fashion, there's a nice walk-on by, this is Helen Mirren walks on as the Queen Mother, and says, there's a, your father was at least smart enough to call Daniel. And there's, and obviously the idea of the big wine feast and things like that with the wives and the concubine, that's titillating, right? It's titillating now, it's titillating them. So it's sort of like, ooh, like there's a little, there's a little sexy thing going on, and there's drinking going on, like, so there's, and then there's the people getting their just desserts. They'll be punished for their transgressions, and the pure one will be rewarded for his faithfulness. This is societies need stories like this, and it is one of the issues of our moment in time is sort of like like a need of a national narrative, right? I would say both in Israel and in the United States, like there's been discussions of like that part of the issues facing these countries that we care for is ensuring that there's a national narrative that large numbers of people can buy into. Like, what does it mean if the Haredim aren't buying into the national narrative of the state of Israel, or much less the Arab sector, right? Like, what does it mean if the extremes of right and left are the ones who are in charge of the national narrative in this country, right? So those things, you need national narratives that work. And this is sort of, I think the Tanakh is partly doing that. And so like every culture needs it. All right, Adkan, the chapter 6, I believe, is the lines done. So again, the hits just keep on coming. These are nice pieces. Where are we at? Thank you for joining. We'll do, for those who come to class in the evening, we'll do it tonight at 7, Gemara, and tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Kabbalat Shabbat, 9:30 a.m. on Shabbat morning, and 8:45